Okay, it's good to be back with you guys, like actually in this room after like a couple like kind of weird weeks of not having our usual lectures happening, how I would take it. How was Dr. Anderson on Thursday? I always think he's kind of a character, so I wonder how it went for you guys. Anything to share out about brain stuff? I don't know 100% what he talked about. He didn't tell me. He wouldn't tell me, so I'm really curious.
It was really cool to learn about parts of the brain and how they adapt.
Yeah. He is the one who like used to teach this class before me. So like, I'm really curious, like how you guys are seeing like a comparison of how you can teach different things. And he was definitely a very systems focused person, like a nervous system week, a digestive system week. It's a little different from how I'm doing it. So I'm really curious how that went. So maybe I'll ask you about it more in lab when we have more time. This week, I got you guys your labs back. You'll have your exam 2 back on Thursday, and should be today that you get the note from me about your outlines. Everybody's outlines looks really good, but for your presentations, thoughts I have, I figure we're in the last couple of weeks here of the course, so you guys are probably making steps towards your presentations. So I want you to get those kind of notes from me. Like I said, what I've seen is pretty excellent, so I'm not too worried about what you guys are going to be able to present. And there's a really interesting amount of topics, kind of a disappointing amount of mammals from my perspective, but that's none of your fault individually. It's a class thing, but that's okay. All right, so this week though, for lecture today and on Thursday, we're spending our time talking about metabolism. So metabolism is this really fundamental part of your physiology, right? Food intake, energy, oxygen expenditure, how you're regulating, how you're chemically balancing, and maybe even thermally balancing with your environment. And so tons of different animals have different adaptations to allow their metabolisms to function in different habitats that they are adapted to. What I like about this kind of a lecture is you guys have you have an idea already about some of the metabolisms. In today's lecture, we're really focusing on metabolic rates, and we're going to talk about that in a second, what that really means. And you guys already have a lot of inherent knowledge of these things to begin with. But I like to start kind of like from a broader kind of first principles look at metabolism. This is one of these figures that like as a biologist makes me go cross-eyed when people who do like biochemistry, cellular biology, microbiology, they get into those incredibly complex ways cells go through processes, enzymes with catalysts of taking something as simple as like food in your gut and making it into energy. We can all learn in intro bio like about how ATP is produced, but all those chemical steps that humans have now figured out, or the way these networks work in crazy ways to complement and regulate each other to keep things balanced. Maybe it's the salt in your cells, maybe it's the water in your cells, maybe it's the temperature of your body. The way these pathways all have feedback loops and self-regulatory measures is truly incredible. And of course, not something we're going to focus on since this is an anatomy class, but the underlying parts of your body working, we have understanding of down to the physics and the chemistry. That's really cool. I think this quote, which is from the beginning of a textbook on things like biochemistry and physiology, is really great. You guys are, in a reduced kind of way, an organism, and organisms are simply just bags of chemicals separated from the rest of the environment. Think about those single-cell organisms all by themselves. Bags of chemicals catalyzed by enzymes that keep yourself different from the nature around you, the empty space around you. That sentence always makes me laugh because it makes me think about when you guys were first learning about vertebrate origins and how we're just a tube within a tube, and then you add a bunch of fancy stuff on it. Well, that tube's got a bunch of chemical reactions being analyzed on the inside. And so one thing I think is really cool about things like metabolic pathways is when we get to like the actual origin of different pathways in how your metabolism works, most of the homologies, the origins of how this chemical becomes that chemical in the cell wall, for instance, these are really deep, like even deeper than like Animalia, let alone vertebrata, really deep things. Certain metabolic processes in bacteria are happening the same kind of way in your cells because they're from like ancient time on Earth history. And so when we're talking today about vertebrate adaptations, what we're really talking about is like ways animals might use their anatomy to like put these reactions in certain places. Right? The actual reactions themselves are ancient things. And so simple thing about physiology, things like that, organisms are subject to the laws of physics, and that includes really simple things like the temperature. One of the base things that you guys probably know about when you think about organisms that aren't human is like hot animals, cold animals. The temperature of your body is going to affect the rate of certain chemical reactions that are happening in your body. And the way that evolutionarily that plays out, and then the way that helps affect the future evolution of your lineage, we're going to talk about that, is really, really, really cool. This is my definition. It's not really something I made up, but it's the definition I'm most comfortable with for like the idea of metabolism. It's just this set of chemical reactions that are life-sustaining in you. So all kinds of ones. There's of course hundreds of them that are happening, but just to like take you guys back to your intro bio kind of stuff, and maybe if you've taken biochemistry, these are kind of the big three things that any organism, not even a vertebrate, any organism has to do to keep an active metabolism, keep itself healthy. You need to be creating energy for yourself, whether you're getting that energy from the sun, like an autotroph would be, or if you're a heterotroph in any kind of form and you're taking in energy from the outside, you need to make that ATP to actually power so many of these reactions in your body. You need to take food and make it into other building blocks. That includes ATP, which is an energy source, but also just to eliminate waste from your body. These are like foundational things that all organisms are going to have to do. I really think this is cool because you guys know about this already. Your body knows what it needs at different times, and you have parts of your brain that are helping to guide you towards foods that you think you want to eat. Sometimes you guys think this sounds really good, and sometimes you think this sounds really good. There is some like higher level, like human like preferences and things like that that take place. But there are times when your body knows it needs things like sugar, things like salts, things like protein. Your body knows that, and that is expressed in you in sort of these fun conversations when you're talking to your friends and you're trying to decide where you want to go. I think this graph is just really interesting for you guys to take in because this class is so focused on vertebrates. This is people who study, this is an animal physiology textbook, but this is from a paper talking about all animals. And this is particularly a graph about spiders. If you feed spiders flies that are really rich in like lipids, it's like really, components of fatty tissues. You can feed them lipid-rich flies, you can feed them protein-rich flies. And depending on what you feed them for a few days, if you then give them the option of which fly they want to eat, they'll preferentially eat flies that have the other thing that they haven't been getting from you for the last couple of days. So just the point is, I'm trying to make with this is like, even beyond vertebrates, every kind of organism has to have these selective, internal, chemically driven drives to like keep themselves as healthy and as like adapted for whatever they're doing as possible. So this is like kind of my general intro to the week. We're going to be talking about, like I said, metabolic rates today, and maybe a little bit about what happens when metabolic rates have to get slow or shut down. And then I think probably all on Thursday, we're going to be talking about some really extreme physiological adaptations that have to do with metabolism. But okay, that's enough of me blabbing at you guys. I was kind of going fast because I started late. So here's our vertebrate tree that you guys know so well by now. All these familiar faces. Yes, great. The homology of all these metabolic processes is very ancient. It predates all of this split on the tree. Please talk to your neighbors for a second. When you think about metabolic rate, whatever you think that might mean, when you think about metabolic rate, how would you compare the different animals here? What do you have something to say? Which animals do you have something to say about when it comes to metabolic rate? Let's go ahead and talk to your neighbor about this for a second.
They said no. You know, me too, yeah.
All right, can I get some volunteers? Like, what are you groups talking about here with metabolic rates?
We were just talking about like maybe the differences between water and animals.
What's the difference maybe between water and land animals when it comes to metabolic rate?
We're thinking like most fish probably have a lower or slower.
A lower metabolism, a slower metabolism. You guys hear this, right? Like when you're a teenager, people say you have like, oh, you have such a high metabolism, you're just burning through food or whatever. Okay, so you're saying that A couple things. You're saying a fish thing, but also a water thing.
Yeah, just, well, not, I guess not all things in water, but they don't have to regulate their body temperature like most animals or.
So Will's got a ton of really interesting and overlapping ideas here. So like general ideas about like fish, general ideas about living in a water environment, about regulation, how much energy it might take to keep things one way or the other, depending on where you live. What are other things groups are talking about? Yeah. Endothermy, ectothermy, people know those words. We're definitely going to talk about it in a second. So can you just tell us what those are?
Yeah, endothermy is like warm-blooded, it's things that regulate their.
Warm-blooded. I'm going to put it in quotes every time I say it. Okay.
That need to regulate and like moving.
So what patterns do you see up here, or what things do you kind of bring with your prior knowledge?
We were talking about like crocodiles and turtles and snakes and things that.
Crocodiles and turtles and snakes and things, AKA reptiles.
Reptiles,
Okay.
yeah. Things that aren't constantly eating and that can just like sit for a long time, digest a big meal, where like the lizard will eat a bunch of food and move around a lot.
What happens to a lion if it eats one wildebeest every year? Right? The crocodile can do that if it gets lucky during the migration. Crocodile eats a big old wildebeest and then just kind of chills out. That's not very healthy for the crocodile. They need to eat more than that, but they can get by on a low amount. So, okay, so the difference between things like a reptile and maybe what we call a bird, which is a very, very, very specialized reptile, and compared to like a mammal. All right, so these are all the ideas I am happy to be hearing talking about. I'll put what Andy set up here. I'm gonna put this in quotes. Warm-blooded and cold-blooded. That's right, cool. So Will kind of got at one of the things I wanted to ask you guys about when he said something. So talk to you over a quick second. I want to hear a little more. How does the surrounding environment, the actual place these organisms live, differ between all these taxa? Talk about that just for a quick second.
If your body. Versus the air.
All right, can I get, what are you guys talking about? Over here, anybody? Yeah, I do.
So kind of talking about like how a deep ocean animal and cold deep ocean be very efficient and like a low balance versus something reef that has lots of food abundant, lots of energy there, so it match that.
So you're thinking like, so you're just taking, so assuming an animal's in the water, the deep, cold ocean, and an animal having what, like a slower metabolism could be
Yeah.
specialized? Okay.
Like a bottom blowing, floating around like a coelacanth or something.
Coelacanth, pretty chilled out, literally and figuratively, sure. Versus the active reef environment, a lot more food, a lot more habitat, a lot more life. Interesting. So how those things might play with each other. There are a couple of ways I think they might play. A simple point I want to make about vertebrates, and this is true for all animals, is that if you live in water, you got problems that you don't have on land. But if you live on land, you got problems you don't have in water. Water, this is not very technical, but I'm saying it like this. Water is a thermal beast. Water has a huge ability to store temperature. It takes very little energy to heat. This is what I mean. Sorry. Wow. If you put 100 calories of energy into fire to 100 grams of water, you might get it to raise by a degree. If you do the same thing to some nails, they'll heat up real quick. That iron will take up that heat. So this is a really interesting graph, an oceanography kind of graph of temperature throughout the depth of water. And if you're an organism that lives in water, this suddenly means a lot to you. So you guys might think, oh, there's seasons, even like in the Arctic Ocean or in parts of the Caribbean, it doesn't matter. In the surface waters, at least there is a wet season, a dry season, a winter and a summer. But in the oceans, here's temperature on the x-axis, here's depth on the y-axis. Really, really, really only in the surface does it matter at all what's happening up in the air. If it's snowing on the top of the North Atlantic, or if it's the middle of July in the North Atlantic, There's gonna be a difference of temperature of a few degrees. But once you go down even a little bit into the oceans, the temperature is gonna stay the same no matter what's going on with the seasons. And of course, it goes down, 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 the deeper and deeper you go. Now, it doesn't go down beyond freezing, right? Because it is water. But it is constant. So if you're an organism that lives down here, kind of like what AJ is talking about, you don't have to worry so much about variability. It might be cold, but you don't so much have to worry about variability. So water is a really important part of habitat that really sets organisms on land apart from organisms in water. That's going to come up a few times today and on Thursday. So even at the surface, there's very little variation in temperature. So, okay, let's get into some of these ideas that like Andy brought up about temperature in organisms. So on that X or Y axis here, you have the body temperature of the organism. You put a little thermometer under its tongue. And on the X axis, you have how hot it is outside or how cold it is outside, from 0 to 40 degrees Celsius. So getting up to like 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Real quick, how would you describe these two lines? Talk to each other for a second. All right, what's a simple description of these two lines that we could use? No, yeah, nobody's talking. It was somebody else who hasn't said anything yet. This is pretty straightforward. How would you describe the difference between these two lines? What's going on?
The reptile has a linear relationship that like when the environmental temperature increases, the body temperature increases.
Okay.
The mouse is constant.
The mouse has a constant temperature. So that mouse's temperature is like 32 degrees Celsius, no matter what it is going on outside. Okay. So these are some of these terms, you guys, I want you to have. So what people have meant historically, and this is especially true if you go back decades into biology, warm-blooded, and I'm going to stop using that word, but warm-blooded, usually what people are talking about is homeothermy. You're keeping your internal body temperature stable. That has nothing to do with cold or hot. It's about stability. So homeothermic animals keep a stable internal body temperature, especially around their core, their brain, their heart, their lungs, their digestive system. Homeothermic animals, you think of birds, you might think of mammals, animals that are warm-blooded are homeothermic. The other term that people used to say is cold-blooded. That one really has fallen out of favor, especially amongst all the scientific communities. One word that has replaced it is poikilothermy. And poikilothermy is a very old word too. It's just not one you guys hear too often. Not as catchy as cold-blooded, I know. Poikilothermy means variable body temperature. And so that could vary for any number of reasons. This lizard, if it's sitting out there waiting for the sun to come up and it's sitting on a rock because it wants to get active that day, that lizard is dependent on an external thing, the sun. But the temperature in its body, what's important with poikilothermy is that it's variable. Not if it's hot, if it's cold, or what's changing it. Just the fact that it's variable at all is what poikilothermy means. But there's some really funny examples here. You cannot just say birds and mammals are homeotherms. That's wrong. And you can't say fish and amphibians and reptiles are poikilotherms. That's also wrong. It might be an okay generalization, but as soon as you start looking at all, it gets problematic. Here's this ice fish. This is a fish that has antifreeze in its blood. It lives under the sea ice in Antarctica all year round, all the time, never changing. The water it's in is 2 degrees Celsius. So that fish is not, it's quite literally cold in its blood, but it's a homeothermic animal. It has a stable body temperature all year round. Homeothermic fish. What about a bear? You guys know bears. Bears are pretty clearly mammals, but a bear is a good example of an animal that hibernates. When that bear goes into a den and starts shutting its systems down for the winter, it can let its body temperature drop down to really low temperatures. So that's not homeothermic, that's poikilothermic. It's a variable core temperature that a mammal can induce in and of itself. Other terms people use that are more modern, they don't have like an antecedent, is things like ectothermy. This is something that Andy said a second ago. Ectothermy doesn't have to do with like the stability of your body temperature, it's where you're getting the heat. Ectotherms get heat from external sources, Endotherms gain heat internally from their own metabolic processes. Now, there's a lot of very different and interesting ways that you can do that, but endotherms are gaining heat internally. They're creating it, they're burning their fuel, they're burning their food to make that temperature happen. So when you see something like an ice fish, cold-blooded isn't going to be a very good descriptor. That ice fish is homeothermic and an ectotherm. So it is truly cold, but its temperature, body temperature is stable. That hibernating bear is poikilothermic because its temperature varies really intensely throughout the year, but it is still an endotherm because when it heats back up, it's not sitting in the sun, it's burning into its fat reserves in the spring to wake itself up. So these are the terms that modern biology uses. As best as you can, let warm-blooded and cold-blooded fall away from you. And think of combinations of homeothermy, poikilothermy, ectothermy, and endothermy. Any questions about that? All right, here's another cool graph, similar to the one you saw before, which was one before was just about body temperature, like a straight up thermometer under the tongue. This is energy output, like how active the animal can actually be. It's not about temperature inside the animal, it's how much energy the animal can expend, given the temperature inside of its body. So here's the lizard graph and here's the mouse graph. Go ahead and talk to each other. What are some patterns and trade-offs you see here? We are mammals, so we tend to think like the mouse one is the way to be. Maybe. I want you guys to talk about that. What are some patterns and trade-offs between these two performance lines?
They have a very narrow.
What are some observations we have for this graph? Ideas that might be coming up for you guys? Yeah, so if it's only 20 degrees Celsius inside the lizard's core, this is like the level of performance possible, the level of energy output the lizard has. What happens for the mouse if its core is at 20 degrees Celsius? Not only is performance dropping really steeply for the mouse, the colder its core gets, its brain, its heart, and all that. Yes, probably at this point, you're talking about actual death from being too cold in the middle of its body, right? This isn't about how hot it is outside. This is like its core temperature. Okay, so that mouse has a really narrow window of performance, but why might that be something that gets selected for?
As a lot higher energy output and those like just can.
If things are going fine for that mouse and its body temperature is around 37 degrees Celsius on the inside, that performance, that amount of energy it can expend, things it can do running around is way higher than the lizard. So there's these different things you can imagine. You know, when you guys think about the way evolution is sometimes thought about and like, you know, the evolution of mammals is this progressive thing from reptiles, that's so wrong. Because not only, of course, there are more species of reptiles than there are mammals anyway, but things like lizards have, you know, this envelope can be really handy adaptively to be able to perform under really different like internal core temperatures. That mouse cannot get too cold. That mouse can also not get too hot. It's a narrow performance range, but it's a high performance range if you're safely in there. These are very interesting things. There's places on Earth, of course, today where like these things overlap in really cool ways. The island of Komodo is a really fun kind of like blast from the past example in the modern world. Water buffalo. This is a water buffalo that's about to like have a very unfortunate and terrible ending at the hands of this Komodo dragon. That water buffalo is a mammal. It's large bodied. It's hard to dump heat from a large body. It's on this tropical island. So it's lethargic and it's definitely trying to stay in the water hole. to like get that water to take the body heat away. So this mammal has performance issues on this tropical island. And unfortunately for it, that same tropical island has these awesome hot conditions that this really big lizard can take advantage of. And so there's these really, I think for some people, really surprising trophic interactions where like really big lizards are like comfortable taking down what are effectively buffalo on the mainland, because you can think of part of it is these thermal interplays. It's too hot, really. That buffalo is like, and the lizard is loving it. Really interesting, right? So switching gears a little bit, just a couple other like physiological observations, kind of these big data, comparative anatomy, comparative diversity slides, how things like our metabolism works. Your heart, of course, you guys now know, is pretty much just a pump. How big your heart is, how powerful your heart is, how it moves blood around your body, and that blood is moving things around, nutrients, it's taking things away, eliminating waste. Some of these really basic metabolic things that have to happen are happening through your blood, and your heart is pumping that blood. How big it is and how fast it's pumping, all different factors that are going to affect an animal's metabolism. So here on the x-axis, we have body mass, the log graph, but you guys are fine with that, I'm sure. Body mass for the animal, and then mass of its heart. And you can see there's a couple trend lines, and then the different color codings for fishes and amphibians and reptiles and birds. So go ahead and talk to each other for a second, make some observations about body mass and heart mass compared across all the different vertebrates. All right, what are a couple like really simple single sentences you guys could take away from this? This is like one of these figures that's just incredible because it's so simple, but it's so much information. If you had to write like one sentence, here's what I learned from this graph. What's one sentence you would write? I heard you all talking about it. Yeah.
It's a relationship between body mass and heart mass.
If you log scale everything, it's a linear relationship, but a relationship nonetheless, right? Relationship nonetheless. Okay, so relationship between how big your heart is, how big your body is. That makes sense, right? You have to pump blood all over your whole body. What else?
In general, endothermic animals seem to have a bigger heart body mass.
Bigger heart for your body mass, right? So if you have a body mass of 5, I don't know what this is, well, let's pretend it's kilograms. You know, a fish heart or an amphibian heart is going to be a little smaller than the average bird, the average mammal heart, right? The other way you can think about that is, you know, a heart of a certain size, the bird that has that heart is going to be smaller than the lizard that has that heart. So this kind of might make sense, doesn't it? That like that heart size for animals that have a higher metabolic rate, that are doing more of this chemical processing in all the different parts of their body, they have to move their blood around a lot more. They get a more powerful heart. That pump is powerful. Anything sticking out otherwise on this graph?
Reptiles can have a variability between like our mammals and birds are on a very straight line, and fishes and amphibians tend to dip below the line, but reptiles have a nice spread.
So you guys know that birds are just fancy pants reptiles. And so of course, like some of these reptiles are a little more spread maybe than others. That's inherently interesting, I think, right? So these lines are not perfect. There are examples of individual taxa that are breaking this like general pattern. And those, I think, would hopefully invite you guys to ask other biological or evolutionary questions. Nobody said it, but like, I think you know who that is. So there's a blue whale heart next to a ladder to give you guys a sense of scale. So one thing that people say about blue whale, this is a blue whale heart that got plasticized after it was taken out of a dead blue whale. So blue whale is one of those animals that are so big that some of its like blood vessels are, you know, big enough that you could physically swim down them when it's full of blood, which you can think that's gross or not. I think it's pretty fantastic. So there's a pretty extreme example of a mammal heart, but how funny is it that it's like, I mean, it's on trend. It's not that crazy. Anyway, there's the big blue whale heart. All right, just a little more graph for you guys, because I think these are really interesting and can be really fun. This isn't about heart size. It's still body mass on the x-axis. It's a lot more data. Don't worry about those rates of max and min. Seriously, please don't. Just pay attention to the colored dots like before. This is about oxygen consumption. It's the actual like energy that has to be being processed. The mitochondria are burning through doing things, creating ATP, so stuff happens. So oxygen is getting used up by these organisms. Here's a graph for animals we might call ectotherms. Here's a graph for animals we might call endotherms. I think it's ridiculous that these two graphs are next to each other, and you can see that the like axes are different. When I saw this, I was mad at this textbook. So here's me editing it for you. So they're actually the same. All right, so one more of these, and then we're gonna move on to other stuff. Oxygen consumption versus body mass in a whole lot of vertebrates. All right, go ahead and talk to each other about that, please. All right, any quick observations here? Obviously, it's pretty similar in a lot of ways.
But the actual, like, obviously, ectoderms are a lot lower.
You mean the slopes of the four lines are pretty similar? Yeah, slopes of four lines are pretty similar. This one is actually the minimum line. So what this graph is showing you like the same animal, like the minimum amount it can take and the maximum amount it can take as measured in the lab. So there's 2 dots for each taxon. That's why there's so many extra dots. And so what's interesting you might notice is that like slope, like these two are pretty similar, min and max. These ones are a little similar to each other, a little bit offset from this, but that minimum performance level for the endotherms kind of has a lower slope. I'll let you interpret that as you will. I think it's cool that you can see that at the maximum line for things like some of these fishes for their body size can be like way up into endotherm range. Other things I notice when I see this is like how birds drop off going this way. What's happening there? Why aren't there more orange dots over here?
They're just not that big.
They're not that big. Don't you wish we had some dinosaur data points? I do. Okay, so those are some cool things, right? These general patterns holding. I think it's just really important for you guys to understand that like these types of studies are pretty fresh, pretty new. Things like using poikilothermic, homeothermic, ectothermic, endothermic, these are all words. And the biology of different animals' metabolic rates and how they use energy, almost always we are being surprised because when somebody actually checks on something, we learn that like some dichotomy or some idea like warm-blooded, cold-blooded really falls away. A lot of the rest of the class, we're going to be talking about very cool exceptions to these very general patterns and like how those animals have specific anatomies to do that. I want to talk a little bit about thermal performance in you guys, only because you are mammals and you have this body temperature thing happening. So you guys are homeothermic endotherms. You keep an internal core body temperature of about 37 degrees Celsius. This guy is standing outside in 68-degree weather. This guy is standing outside in 95-degree weather. So you can look at how the temperature of his body plays out. His core, his heart, his lungs, his brain is 37 degrees no matter what's going on outside. But yes, his hands can get cold when it's cold outside. He can get sweaty and be trying to dump heat when it's hot outside. But that core, that's what being a homeothermic endotherm means. You're self-regulating that core temperature at about 37 degrees. You guys probably know that it does not take very much temperature. You have a fever once you start to get 99, 100 degrees inside your body, right? Only a degree or two, you start to have problems if you're going up. The same is true when you're going down. You can think of people like falling into the ocean, you know, when the Titanic is sinking and the water's freezing cold, but their core body, when they start to die, that's not because like their body's now 30 degrees. Their core is getting down to like the low 90s, the 80s. It doesn't take much to have these different physiological reactions to your core temperature changing. Dilation, not dilation, having to hyperventilate. Things happen to you very quickly if your core, the actual internal deep temperature of your body is really pushed. I'm gonna put this up here, not focus on it. If you guys are curious, for any medically inclined people, like the actual like thresholds for different kinds of hypothermia. So your body temperature changing across different levels. Severe hypothermia is when you're getting down to like 82 degrees Fahrenheit in your core. That's really, really low. What we can talk about here for a second, and you guys are, I think will, I hope think this is interesting. This is always something that's outside my wheelhouse, but I get so sucked into it every time I think about it. Here's body temperature. Your core body temperature is kept at 37 degrees. But if you go and it gets too hot, or if you go and it gets too cold, performance really shifts. All of those circulating, self-regulating chemical reactions either speed up or slow down, and eventually things get really out of whack if your core goes one way or the other too much. So here's this graph. This graph is crazy. It's too much. I encourage you to look at it when I put it up on Moodle. But here's the idea. Is this range of temperatures here, environmental temperature on this axis, this range of temperatures here, your body, your homeothermic, endothermic body can keep itself regulated. But if it gets to be too hot, if you're out in the desert and it's 130, 140, and you're stuck there and you can't cool off. If you're out in Idaho and it's 18 degrees outside and you cannot get inside or you cannot find a coat, things are gonna start to happen to you. And so these are two different graphs talking about like how your body's producing heat, how your body's taking oxygen. There's these things that happen in your metabolism where your metabolism like gets more intense in both directions. When you're getting too hot or too cold, different parts of your metabolism are firing up. And then of course, eventually they spiral out of any control. That's a lot of information. Like I said, I encourage you to look it up. It allows comparative biologists to make charts like this. So here we have ambient temperature of the environment on the x-axis, resting metabolic rate, how your body is churning through processes on that y-axis. You want to always live your entire lifetime as best as you can in this thermal neutral zone, the range of temperatures where your body can keep that internal cycling in a constant, you guys are mammals, so you need it to be homeothermic, endothermic position. But there's every kind of animal, not just you, has an upper and a lower threshold where if the temperature changes outside and then your body core temperature starts to follow it, you are going to react. And so you're seeing here the lines going up in both cases, if it's hot or if it's cold, because your metabolic rate is spiraling up, trying to somehow bring you back into that stable thermal zone. So this is just a very, very, very simple 3-line summary graph to explain that sort of like necessary temperature maintenance for your internal regulation. Animals stay there with their anatomy, with their metabolism. Lizards will stay there by finding a hot rock, by hiding in the shade. You can change it behaviorally. There's lots of ways to stay in this thermal neutral zone. Here is a chart of a real animal's measured metabolic rate in different conditions in the real world. That's a ptarmigan, so an Arctic grouse-like animal, chicken-like animal, a bird, of course. So here's oxygen consumption, actually really measured for a ptarmigan that lives in the Arctic, where it can be quite hot and it can be quite cold throughout the year. Please talk to your neighbor for a second. Tell me about this ptarmigan's metabolic rate, given what's going on outside. Yeah. Or centimeter. I would have been doing that. No, that's great. All right, so what are some patterns and observations here? This isn't a theoretical line, this is real target data. So what's going on with this target throughout the year? Or anything you might want to say about that.
We discussed like how it's better to be colder than it is to be hot.
Why is it better to be cold than be hot?
So just like be efficient in a way, like your metabolism can get you back to the temperature rather than when you're hot, it's like just useful.
If this bird starts to heat up, that's a seemingly more persistent and immediate problem than if it starts to get a little cold. The energy output it would have to take to like bring its body temperature back is lower if it's 10 degrees colder than this threshold. Than if you go 10 degrees up here, you can't even go that far. That bird's gone. It's gonna die. What other things people might notice about this? Remember that this flat line is that thermal neutral zone, and this is the ptarmigan's thermal neutral zone. So this ptarmigan's thermal neutral zone, the outside air can be under 10 degrees Celsius. It can be almost 40 degrees Celsius. And for the ptarmigan, those are almost the same for its internal metabolic rate. So that ptarmigan has a huge amount of temperature, can stand there in and not react to, right? The actual flat part of the line is pretty intense. And then I absolutely agree with what Miley said that like, it's easier for this bird, think about where this bird lives. It's easier for this bird to get cold and metabolism like turns up a little bit than it is for this bird to get hot. This is an Arctic tundra bird. It's a cold, usually habitat living bird. That's very cool. So this is one animal's profile, and there's some general patterns here we can take. I'm about to show you a graph that's got a ton of animals all overlaid on each other. And we can talk about differences they all have. And again, this is one of those graphs that could drive you guys to ask questions, to have hypotheses about what you're seeing. Brace yourselves. All right. What you're seeing here is the temperature outside up to 30 degrees. Here's that basal metabolic rate, just putting it at 100 for all of them. So they're all scaled to the same flat metabolic rate. Each of them have a different rate, but they're scaling it to what's best for them, right? And then there's a whole bunch of other stuff happening. So go ahead and talk about what's happening inside these animals and differences that might be going on with temperature outside. Any observations about this? You don't have to overly interpret it all. There's too much information here, I think. I'm not talking to you guys about how body temperature is related to this line, but I think you can see that it somehow is. But just how about just comparing the lines? What kind of patterns? How about this? If you took the thermostat and went like this down 10 degrees to a sloth versus a lemming, how are they both going to react?
Sloth's kind of way bigger reaction than
Look at this poor sloth living in these tropical Costa Rican and Brazilian forests, right? Hanging there, being a cool sloth. Its metabolic rate goes up to 300% if you drop the temperature of that rainforest down a pretty not crazy amount of degrees. That sloth has a really narrow thermal tolerance. Its metabolic rate has to work really hard. If you take it from 30 degrees, I don't know if the numbers are, I'm not looking at them. If you take it from 30 degrees and put it to 24 degrees Celsius, that sloth has huge problems. Whereas any Arctic animals, like that happens every day to me. Right? What other things people notice?
granules are a lot more suited to handling those drastic changes in temperature, really just in one direction.
So I heard one group say that these are like all mammals. This is all comparative mammals. Some of them are big, some of them are small, but they're all mammals at least. Some of this is extrapolated data based on like natural history observations. But like Arctic foxes are out there walking on the open Arctic Ocean sea ice in the middle of winter, like walking to Norway from Greenland, and they're just a little fox. So this fox, you can put the air temperature to horribly cold temperatures, and its metabolism does not have to work all that hard. That's really, 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 really crazy, and show you how you can have adaptations. That fox has fat, that fox has fur, to keep yourself down into certain ranges. What I think is so important about this is that these are fundamentally critical parts of these animals' biology. The tropics are where so much diversity is, but the tropics are also pretty, in terms of thermal properties, pretty steady places. It's always pretty hot. If you make it way hotter, or if you make it cold kind of suddenly, you can really mess with that. Animals that live in Idaho, animals that live in Alaska, they might have, in terms of their thermal tolerances, huge flexibility. One of the reasons graphs like this stress out biologists, because we can talk about things like climate change, where the polar animals' habitats, they might have really good ability to adapt to thermal stressors, but their habitat's actually disappearing. Versus the tropical animals, by the way, that's where like all the species really are, who like cannot do much if you make it hotter or faster hotter or colder too fast. Lizards in the tropics are one of the absolute biggest groups of vertebrates that biologists are freaked out about with climate change, because so many lizards have thermal tolerances that are like this. And so the lizards in Idaho don't have that. The lizards in Idaho are good to go. But the lizards in like the tropics, if you make it 29 degrees instead of 27 degrees, a lot of them can't perform, they can't reproduce. And that's something like we might actually see this century. So these thermal tolerances are critical parts of these animals' biology to allow them to reproduce, to feed, to move, to do whatever they have to do to live their lives. And those are different, even in mammals, anatomical and physiological adaptations to their different habitats. Okay, any questions about this? All right, now I want to talk about cool warm-blooded, cold-blooded problems. So this is a figure from just 3 years ago, from 2020. It's the vertebrate phylogeny. You guys probably know most of those words by now, but this is from a real honest to goodness paper. Nice silhouettes of different animals. This is talking about how endothermy, so remember endothermy is creating your own heat, your own metabolism, creating body heat, keeping you warm. That's what homeothermy is. Different kinds of endothermy across the tree of vertebrates. Go ahead and talk to your neighbors, tell me about some patterns you notice when it comes to this. I'm not telling you what the colors are on purpose, but I'll let you talk to each other. All right, what are some things jumping out to people about this whole vertebrate phylogeny, or really whole well, no, it's vertebrate. This whole vertebrate phylogeny when it comes to endothermy, what's like really quick things? Yeah, Calvin.
Most of them use NST, whatever that is.
Most of them use NST, whatever that is. We can talk about that. Non-shivering, it means like, so when your body starts to shiver, which is involuntary, it's your like external tissues like creating heat. So it's just non-shiver thermy. It means you're doing something metabolic to keep your heat up, something that is not about physical movement. It's your cellular processes. Yeah.
I know that the sea turtle is assumed to be ectothermic, but functionally.
Yo, that sea turtle's got a question mark on it. We'll talk about it later.
Okay.
What else? We're about really just straightforward things that are like, pretend there's nothing complicated. What's really clear on this chart, on this phylogeny?
There are fish, mammals, and birds all that have the same methods of.
Yeah, right. So you can see that there's some fishes. I think one of the things that should be really clear to you guys is there's a reason like Victorian biologists are like warm-blooded and cold-blooded, because there are some pretty clear, yes, there are some fishes, but there are generally some pretty clear divisions here amongst different groups that are totally biologically real. Birds are a monophyletic clade, and there's no doubt they are all homeothermic, endothermic animals for them almost complete, even in their details. So birds are a monophyletic group of endotherms. And so are mammals. That's not a surprise. You guys knew that, right? This is why we have these ideas in our heads from when we first learn about animals when we're like kids. So birds and mammals, of course, I'm going to talk to you about all these crazy things that are challenging the paradigm, but birds and mammals for sure are endotherms. And so what do birds and mammals share to the exclusion of other groups? Four-chambered hearts. That's something. That's metabolic. What else? Think about that first week of class when you guys were trying to make a list of like what makes a bird, or what makes a fish, or what makes it. The easiest ones, don't even think about it once. Fur and feathers. There's a reason you kind of think birds are like you in some ways. They're insulated animals. Both of these clades, and it's a very interesting evolutionary question to know which came first, that metabolic rate or that insulation. Just like your house is insulated in the winter, the core, brain, lungs, heart, digestive system, the core organs of a bird and the core organs of a mammal are almost totally all the time in every species actually insulated from the environment. Mammals use it with fur, birds do it with feathers, but this is a really simple biological thing. You guys kind of already knew that, right? The hot running animals are insulated against the external environment. So when it's cold outside, their body temperature can stay constant. That's not a big deal. I'm not gonna spend time on that. You guys know that. I'll go only into paleontology for 1 second, I promise. And that is, of course, the fact that birds are a kind of dinosaur. And so dinosaur biology, as we learn more and more and more and more and more and more every single year about things like extinct animals, the more it gets really, really fun. Definitely dinosaurs in terms of their body size get to be very mammalian, even surpassing mammals. Definitely in terms of their integument, meaning things like feathers or feathery structures or bristles or downy coverings. Tons of dinosaurs have those things. So the question always becomes, where in dinosaur evolution do you start to get these coverings? The same question is true for mammals, by the way, too. Ultimately, mammals come from something that looks pretty reptile-y. So where does the fur come in? As well as all these other adaptations, like that four-chambered heart. So this is a really good example of this dinosaur fauna that's only been described in the last 20 years or so from Alaska, the north slope of Alaska. So these were dinosaurs that even back in dinosaur times when the world is pretty hot and there's no ice caps, it's still snowy and dark and cold in Alaska. And these are dinosaurs that like stayed there. Some of them migrated. Now we know some of them didn't. They just lived there all year round. So there's different kinds of dinosaurs that like have to have had thermal adaptations. And dinosaurs are paraphyletic relative to birds. Birds are a kind of dinosaur in the monophyletic dinosauria. And so here's a nice example of a paper from Science trying to get proxies, like things we can measure in the bones that might indicate homeothermy. Mammals have signals, birds have signals, crocodiles and like some fishes for sure don't. And then dinosaurs have these weird like in between. So people made up this term. It's completely like, it's sort of a complicated thing. Mesothermy, halfway, what does it mean? So this is where like a lot of active science is really happening. That's really cool. And again, I want to emphasize the fact that like we are finding more and more and more dinosaurs, especially the ones that are actually very close to birds, that are totally completely feathered like any modern bird is. So their physiology, their metabolism, I'm sure, I would bet a lot is like pretty much avian. That's very, very, very cool. Fossils help us get at these bigger questions we can look at using the modern. The same thing is true for our group, like I said. Here's geologic time on the left. Here's mammals and reptiles on the phylogeny. So there's the three groups. There's a little possum, there's a platypus, there's you. You guys know those groups now very well. We know they're all kind of homeothermic endotherms. The platypuses are not so great at it. Interesting. And so where in mammal evolution, animals like this and animals like this are our relatives as far as what's still alive on this planet. So where in there did things like homeothermic adaptations evolve? Where did things like integument evolve, like hair? This is interesting. Anyway, I'll stop. But I just want to make that point, that phylogeny of living groups can then be used to like look back in the fossil records. So here's a bunch of dinosaurs colored gray by those authors, because those dinosaurs have been measured via different proxies for how their metabolism might be running and shown to be higher than what you might see in a lizard, but maybe not as high as you might see in a bird. So what do we do? Interesting stuff, but also exactly what you'd expect through evolution. Some other things I think are really cool. So birds and mammals are insulated. They have feathers and they have fur. There are some birds, like that ptarmigan you saw, they have feathers all the way down their legs and on their feet. So even their feet are totally insulated. Some animals though, like that junco or this seagull, both wonderful Idaho animals that you might see in the winter, they do all kinds of things to keep that body heat up inside their bodies on parts of their bodies that are exposed to the cold. So for instance, if you took a temperature of all these different parts of this seagull's leg, the seagull keeps up here where the feathers are pretty much at its core body temperature. And as you get down to the foot, that foot can be as cold as the ground. So if you guys are ever like outside in December and you see like a bird standing on a branch, you can see it's like little toesies getting frozen. Don't worry, it is adaptive to have that happen. There's countercurrent heat exchange where the blood coming down and the blood going up, the blood going into the foot transfers its heat to the blood going back up into the body. These animals keep it so that the core is the same and they have very little, everything down here is connective tissue, ligament, skin. A lot of it's like, it doesn't have a lot of senses in it, right? They let this get really cold. So using things like countercurrent, when blood's going in different directions, countercurrent heat exchange to keep warmth, actual physical, like measurable warmth in different parts of your anatomy is something we're gonna see a lot of animals do. So using that blood, which is again, being pumped by a single heart to get that heat contained. A really, really, really fun example of having to keep your heat contained are birds or mammals, but we're gonna talk about birds right now, that go live in places like the ocean, which unlike the air, the ocean, the water, will suck the heat out of your body really fast. And so if you're a bird who's a homeothermic, endothermic animal, like this penguin that lives in the oceans, you have to have all kinds of adaptations. This is another paleo thing, so I'm sorry, but I'm not sorry. So modern day penguins do countercurrent heat exchange to keep their flippers nice and active, but also pretty cold relative to their internal body temperature. They do this same thing, countercurrent heat exchange. This is a fossil penguin from about 30 million years ago, as Antarctica started to get cold and freeze for the first time, as Antarctica became really cold. This is a fossil penguin, and on this penguin's humerus, there's actually grooves where like the blood vessels are sinking down into the bone. So this bird is partly, as it's adapting to cold weather, cold climate really, putting its blood vessels into the bone to keep them from being totally exposed to the ocean. I don't know how cool you think that is. I remember being like blown away when I saw this talk at a conference. So penguins, as they adapted to becoming Arctic, absolutely not, Antarctic ocean animals, they had these kind of anatomical adaptations. That's so cool. What about mammals returning to the water? Talk to your neighbors for a second. How do mammals retain their body heat when they go into that terrible, terrible water that takes whatever it wants heat-wise from you? What do mammals do? All right, so I'm hearing people say stuff about this otter, things like beavers. What did I say? Yeah, otter, beavers, muskrats. What are mammals doing to keep their heat when they're in the water? They have fat. What do we call it when it's a lot of fat? Blubber. Maybe they have blubber. Some of them though, like this otter and other otters and things like beavers, they of course do have some body fat, but a lot of the adaptations are in their integument. They're in their fur. Polar bears famously have like really long fur, and the fur itself is hollow. There's like an open space in each of the hairs on a polar bear. So if you have all of those on you, that's a little bit like of an air layer. They also trap air in their feathers. A lot of ducks and other diving birds do this too. So that sea otters are always grooming themselves. They have to keep their hair very nice and clean. Sometimes there's specialized oils animals will put onto their hair, secreted from glands in their skin. You guys know mammals have glandular skin. To keep their hair, the actual outside of their bodies, pushing away water in ways where that water can take thermal energy from them. So fur for sure, air pockets in their fur for sure, grooming for sure, of course, fat and blubber. The sea otter doesn't have an amazing amount of blubber, but of course, many marine mammals do. Sorry for this image that upsets you, but this is a sperm whale getting processed somewhere, I don't know where. So a sperm whale that was caught, and here these people are peeling back this sperm whale's blubber. That's how much blubber is on that sperm whale. Those people are trying to get to the organ in the sperm whale's nose, where there's a bunch of like stuff that we use to light oil mix with, but we don't do that anymore. But anyway, you can see how thick the blubber is. So that insulating fat is like effectively dead tissue. There's like sensory stuff in there, but for the most part, it is like just sitting there acting as an absolute huge amount of like pink panther insulation around the hot core of that whale against the cold ocean. That's really cool. Now, convergently, tons of mammals that have evolved ocean-going habits have evolved blubber, as you all well know. I'll let you enjoy this for a minute. Right? This is convergence. Cetaceans, pinnipeds, sirens, those three clades are all independently marine adapted. They all were like, hey, guess what? And they pumped up as an insulating thing, right? Because they're all mammals with mammalian physiology, mammalian metabolic rate. Yeah.
Is that true of those two?
Yeah. Yes.
Tropical, it's still in the water.
But still tropical, but that water is still just like a heat suck. So, you know, and hippos are big animals that have all kinds of interesting trade-offs. Like hippos don't come out of the water in the daytime because it's hot in the sun, and they're all fat. They're all fat because they're in the water. There's a lot of these interesting trade-offs these animals have that like make their lives, they adapt behaviorally, right? It's very cool. All right, there's some mammal stuff and some general ideas. Cold weather birds and mammals, water birds and mammals. Birds and mammals are the easy ones. In the old days, we'd say they're more complicated. You guys know it's more complicated than that. Those are some adaptations. All right, for this last bit of class, I want to go talk about all the stuff that this paper is actually about and what actually probably caught your eyes, where you're like, what's that fish? What's that lizard? All these interesting things. A lot of this is organismal biology in the last 20 years, like your guys' lifetime, where people actually check and learn, oh, wow, never mind. This is a homeothermic fish. This is an endothermic fish. That's really crazy. So I'll talk about a couple examples of some fishes. So you can see there's a couple different ways. This green is pretty like nothing. It says other thermogenic mechanisms. Doesn't mean they're doing the same thing. They're just doing something. So let's talk about some cool fish examples of endothermy, creating your own heat. We're also going to talk about a python, some lizards, some other reptiles. So here's what a couple fishes have been discovered to do. Fishes like tunas, which are big, powerful swimming fishes that you guys remember from our fish diversity lectures, and things like really big sharks, laminate sharks, things like basking sharks, great white sharks, megamouth sharks, mako sharks. Also, open ocean, big, powerful swimming fishes. One's an actinopterygian, one's an elasmobranch. They have really similar adaptations. Their muscles, when they're swimming, are just creating tons of heat because there's tons of mitochondria burning to create that swimming. They then take the heat created by their muscles and using their circulatory system, disperse the heat around their bodies. They preferentially keep it in their most powerful swimming muscles and then up towards their eyes and their brain. Other parts like their fins, even their stomachs are not being kept endothermic, not being kept homeothermic, I should say. With this endothermic behavior, like in a mammal, you do it all. These fishes are doing it selectively for what they're doing at the time, swimming, looking. If that is a higher temperature, enzymes can happen, chemical reactions can happen faster, those eyes can be more active, those muscles can be more active. So in that cold ocean, the muscle movement of that shark, the muscle movement of that fish can create heat that it disperses to places it needs the heat for what it's doing then. That's really, really remarkable. Things like a fish's gills. You guys have seen these in lab when we dissected the bowfin. These are the gills. Look how red they are, right? Full of blood. So that blood can exchange oxygen with the environment. For a fish, these gills are problematic when it comes to trying to be an endotherm, trying to have heat inside your body, because that's a ton of surface area. And if you put blood into your gills to get oxygen and then lose all your heat to the water, that's going to cost a lot. So all of these fishes have countercurrent heat exchange, just like you saw on that seagull leg, right before their gills. So all the blood that's coming back in from the gills is taking all the heat from the blood that's going into the gills. Does that make sense? So the blood that's going through the body is nice and hot. Right before it goes into the gills, it gives its heat to the blood that's coming back in. So this potential cost to a fish that's trying to retain its body heat in the oceans, it has adaptations to keep that heat inside its body, but still pull oxygen from the water. Do you guys see how that's like a really hard trade-off? You have to breathe if you're trying to stay warm. So they have adaptations to do both. Penguins and whales don't have to worry about that. Ichthyosaurs don't have to worry about that. They are sitting here with lungs. They're not putting their vascular tissue into that freezing water all day. Very, very cool. A couple other pieces from that figure have to do with like specific heating. So I already kind of told you about tunas. Turns out some fish like swordfish and marlin, they keep really active muscle activity up in their heads. That muscle activity is so much that they effectively heat their eyeballs and their brains only. So like a marlin, the whole body that's swimming isn't being kept all that hot, but it is creating and then retaining heat in its sensory structures and in its brain. So when it's hunting, it's elevating the metabolic abilities of certain organs in its head. That's really insane. I hope that freaks you out, because that is like not what you do. You turn it all on hot and you keep it all on hot and you just live your life. Doesn't matter what you're doing. These animals can behaviorally heat up parts of their body. These is red muscle tissues deep in the skull of this marlin that are heating up its eyeballs during the day when it's like going around and hunting. That's really remarkable. One of the coolest examples of this came out a couple of years ago. You see, this is a paper from 2015. This is the opa. It's a lampriform fish. You guys also saw the oarfish, the one that was like really, really too long, like a ribbon. That's in the same group as this opa. This is a great example of people just doing science. They were attaching tethers to these opa to learn about their migration, learn about their behavior, these little sensory things that could like take data throughout the day with this fish. And these people didn't necessarily expect to find this. What they did find was this fish, which swims with its caudal fin a little bit, but for the most part is just flapping its pectoral fin to swim around in the open ocean. It has this heat profile. And if you put a temperature into this fish and track its day-to-day behavior, the pectoral fin flexure creates enough heat that it becomes endothermic, and then it becomes partially homeothermic, only partially, because it again moves that blood that's nice and hot all around to different parts of its body. This is one of the figures from that paper that's super, super cool. Here's them catching a fish at 7 o'clock at night. Here is them letting that fish go at 10:20 p.m. It's got a sensor on it. They release the fish. You can see these different lines. There's the water temperature in blue, the depth that the fish dove to when it was trying to catch little things to eat in black. So the fish goes down deep. The water temperature drops. It doesn't keep dropping, right? The water has a temperature it stays at. And then here's the internal temperature in the muscles of the pectoral fin of the fish throughout that dive. How would you compare that internal fish muscle temperature to the ocean and to the depth? Steady. That's all you need to say, right? This fish is creating its own heat, so it's endothermic, and it's almost in those muscles homeothermic because it keeps doing it. It's maintaining that temperature. Now, it's not quite like mammals, right? Because it's like losing heat too, and it's creating more. So it's like a little bit of like a runaway thing. It'd be hard to keep it up if you were this fish, and this fish doesn't do it all the time. But there's endothermy, true endothermy. How we measure it, how we define it, absolutely in this fish. What time is it? All right, we can do the reptile thing real quick. And then next on Thursday, we'll start with some other like really specific parts of this lecture. So here's another scientific paper with too much data. This is a tegu. This is a South American pretty big lizard. This lizard has adaptations where it can like turn on endothermy with its internal metabolism. It can heat up its body, and it only does that in the reproductive part of its year, its annual cycle, when it has eggs in its burrow. So this is a lot of data trying to establish a baseline with you guys. So this is the temperature of the burrow in green in January, April, June, and October. You can see the burrow is like a pretty stable environment. That's why animals live in burrows. Here's the amount of sun the animal's getting in January, in April, or that are outside the burrow in June and October. And this is a lizard. So a lot of the time, this lizard wakes up in its burrow, pretty much the same temperature as it went to bed. The lizard goes outside its burrow, sits on a rock in the sun, heats up, lives its day, goes back to its burrow, goes to sleep. And so in times like January, which is like a chill time in this lizard's life, you can see its temperature matches the sun and then goes back to the burrow. It goes into dormancy, a kind of hibernation, but it's not really hibernation. We'll talk about that on Thursday in April. And so you can see the lizard's temperature is kind of just wherever the burrow temperature is. It's not going out and sitting in the sun at this time of year. What is interesting is here in October, when the organism has laid her eggs. She does not go out and sit in the sun because she's staying with her eggs, but her body temperature goes up. It's not going up because she's going to the sun. It's going up because only during this time of her year, here's the statistical Tegu's temperature minus burrow temperature, the difference. These months, nothing. October, she's significantly hotter than her burrow, but she's not going outside. She's doing it because she's sitting there with her eggs and then with her very small lizard babies. Here are some thermal images from inside that burrow. So here she is in January. Temperature-wise, right? Dirt and the lizard are the same color. This is like an infrared camera. Here, when she has her eggs and when her babies are born, look how hot she is relative to her burrow. Her internal metabolism, she turns on to heat up her eggs. So there's endothermy in this lizard, only sometimes in the year and in a very specific, pretty awesomely adaptive purpose to successfully raise her babies. The last example I'll show you guys today is this python. Pythons are snakes. And this is quite a big snake. These snakes can create body heat by like twitching all the muscles that run along their bodies. So when she's got her clutch of eggs, depending on the temperature outside, if they start to get what she thinks is cold, she twitches her muscles and wraps around them and she creates heat that then spread to the eggs. So that's not really the same thing as other endothermic animals. It's using muscle twitching. It's almost like she's creating her own shivering, but it's a weird thing. I'm gonna skip to the final chart here. So this is that lizard you just saw. Here's the python doing something weird, and you guys just saw some fishes doing something weird. I know we're out of time, so I will let you guys out of here for today. But I encourage you to think about these things. Think about some other pieces of animals biology that might be tied to these metabolic adaptations. All right, thank you. I'll see you Thursday.